The next speaker, is Dr. Sarah Garfinkel. So Sarah Garfinkel is currently a professor at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, University College London, where she leads the clinical and affective neuroscience group. She completed her PhD in experimental psychology at the University of Sussex. She has trained in psychiatry and neuroscience at the University of Michigan, followed by further training and her first faculty position at the Brighton and Sussex Medical School. So today she will present her talk titled Multisensory Integration for Touch and Feelings of Dissociations. Okay, so the floor is yours, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you. It's such an honour to be able to speak at this Women in Neuroscience workshop. And I have a confession to make, which is this is my first ever talk on touch. So I'm a little shy to be speaking to you today, but I'm very excited. But on that note, I really would like to credit the team that's done this work really with me. But Jamie Moffatt really did take the lead. He's a fantastic PhD student in the lab, and this work is part of his PhD. Kathy Greenwood is the supervisor who co-supervises with Jamie. And the paradigm that we used was really driven by Bigner, Marta, and others also in Bigner's lab, and Valerio, who was a student visiting us from Rome, helped with the cardiac analyses. So really all credit to the team. It wouldn't have happened without them. So brain and body are intrinsically and dynamically coupled together, and extraceptive senses help us understand about the world, whereas interoception is the sensing of internal bodily sensations, such as our heartbeats. And it refers to the process by which the nervous system senses, interprets, and integrates signals originating from within the body, providing a moment-by-moment mapping of the body's internal landscape across conscious and unconscious levels. But to really have an experience of ourselves in the world, we need to integrate these interoceptive and extraceptive senses together. And the work that I typically do is interoception, looking at different dimensions of interoception. For example, looking at our accuracy with which we sense internal sensations. But the afferent signal itself is often neglected from these models. And an afferent signal that I'm interested in is the heart, such as heart rate and heart rate variability. And this is so important when we're trying to understand different clinical groups, because you get very different cardiac signatures in these different groups. So for example, a nice variable heart rate is a healthy thing. You want the heart to be adaptive, whereas individuals, for example, with schizophrenia tend to have a much more regular beating heart. So in this work, I'm going to talk to you about the role of multisensory integration in unusual experiences linked to dissociation. And I'm going to be looking at the heart and integration also with extraceptive senses such as touch and vision. And dissociation is a form of anomalous self-experience, and it can manifest in different ways. So you can have depersonalization, such as thoughts and feelings that seem unreal or do not belong to self. Derealization, where you feel like your surroundings are not real. Emotional numbing, also detachment from body. And there can be many different manifestations of dissociation, and these can range from benign to more severe experiences. And you see elevated dissociation in a number of clinical conditions, such as schizophrenia, depression, but it also can be a condition on its own. And in this nice paper with quotes from patients, one said, "It's as if what appears to be the reality around me is crumbling." And there have been many paradigms in the past that have tried to recreate unusual bodily sensations. I'm sure you're all familiar with the rubber hand illusion, which is a valid and interesting procedure in itself. However, this really tries to capture embodiment, which is not quite the same as dissociation. And we were very inspired by this really cool new task that came out of Bigner's lab, and you've got to check it out. It's in Cognition, and it was published last year. And it uses virtual reality as a form of augmented reality to look at touch and vision together. And it's so neat. It does this really cool thing where it puts a delay on the visual field, which means you have the potential to separate out touch and vision. So in the long form of this task, you have conditions which is no delay, which is basically just like real life, where touch and vision happen at exactly the same time. Whereas if you put a delay onto the visual field, then what happens is touch happens first, you experience touch, and then you see the touch occur. So you have this capacity to disentangle touch and vision, and you can also do it for self-touch and other touch by getting people to touch themselves or having other people touch you. And self and other touch is potentially important because the processing of self-generated sensations could be key for unusual experience in the way that they're processed. And you get this classic finding with tickle where it's harder to tickle yourself, but individuals prone to schizophrenia don't necessarily have this dampening down of tickling with self-generated touch. Theoretical links of dissociation have also been posited by Anna Cianuccia, and it's really not known that well yet whether self and other generated touch differently associate with anomalous experience in terms of dissociation pathology. And looking at the role of the heart and how that might be part of the picture is still yet to be understood. So in this experiment, we recruited 100 participants with no history of psychiatric developmental neurological disorders. And we looked in the age range of 18 to 36. They tended to be more female with a mixed range of ethnicities. And we looked at anomalous experiences in this general population. And although dissociation is often found heightened in conditions like schizophrenia and depression, you really do get a range of people in the general public having dissociation or a tendency for it. And we administered a number of scales, but I'm going to focus on the Cambridge Depersonalization Scale today. And in this mixed reality task, there's a long version and a threshold version. In the long version, it's a 2x2 design where you have two sources, which is self-touch and other touch. And then we had two delay conditions, which was no delay, so just like real life, and then a 1 second delay on the visual field. So touch happens 1 second before you see the touch. And then we asked after each trial these questions about whether they felt alienation from their body, as if their body doesn't belong to them anymore, the body was numb, as though the experience of the hand is less vivid than normal, and these other questions which map onto disownership, deafference, embodiment, derealization, and pleasantness. And what we found, which really replicates the finding of Bigner and others, is that you get this change in these different measures with the delay. So this paradigm was good at eliciting heightened feelings of disownership, deafference, and derealization when a delay was imposed, and that embodiment and pleasantness decreased with this delay. But using this manipulation in itself, there were no very dramatic differences between self and other touch. It was really the delay that drove these. But what we did find was that the average disownership rating that people gave within this task was related to their own personal dissociation score that we ascertained with the questionnaires. So it shows that this task is a really good task of experimentally inducing measures of disownership, which did correlate with people's own trait-like tendency to have dissociation. And then you also start to see some cool differences in the heart, specifically in high heart rate variability in the high frequency domain. And what we find is that a delay specifically for other touch, not so much for self-touch, causes this drop in high frequency heart rate variability. And then we're also showing differences in interoception linked to derealization, such as higher interoceptive ability is associated with more derealization and more deafference. So maybe if the heart is doing something different, then a better capacity to accurately sense it can give rise to these different derealization and deafferent feelings. And then in the second part of this paradigm, instead of just having two delays, it systematically varies the delay, so you can make the delay incrementally longer to see when people start to notice that vision and touch are separate, and you can look at the threshold of that. So you can see at what point is the difference noticeable. And this was 80 trials, which were 9 seconds each. And because there were more trials, we just asked fewer questions. We focused on, it felt as if the touch movement I saw and felt was synchronous, because we're looking at the point at which they don't become synchronous anymore. I felt as if the hand was my own, the experience felt pleasant. And you can see these incremental delays that were given, which were the same for both self and other touch. And in this graph, we are able to determine the point called the sensitivity to delay, or the point of subjective equality, which is actually defined by when people have an equal probability of answering yes or no to it felt as if the touch movement I saw and felt was asynchronous. So you can see where people can no longer differentiate between what is synchronous and what is not. And then this does differ for self and other touch. So you can see that for self-stroking, you need a 265 millisecond delay in order for people no longer to be able to tell the difference between self and other stroking. For vision and touch, then disentangle at that time. And then other stroking, it's 291. So people, in other words, are more likely to, when you're being stroked by someone else, they can be further apart in time for you to notice that they are actually separate. Where for self-touch, if they are separated in time, you're more sensitive to notice that there's a time delay for self-touch. Moreover, the sensitivity to delay for self-touch is related to this dissociation score. And it's in this really interesting direction, whereas those people with a much higher tendency to suffer from dissociation are much more sensitive to delay. So they're much more likely to notice that vision and touch are separated in time. And this makes me think that our senses are being processed at different speeds all the time. And in order for us to have a coherent experience of the world, we want to bind them together to give us a unified percept. And a tendency to bind them together is associated with lower dissociation. Whereas if you're someone who's very sensitive to time delays in processing different senses, then you're more likely to experience dissociation. And that's what this graph tells us. So binding things together is protective if you have a greater tendency to do that. And then for the heart, you can see that the heart differs for other and self-touch, but it really wasn't that sensitive to the time delay using this threshold task. You just have a greater cardiac response for other versus self-touch. But then it gets really interesting when you separate it for individuals who are low dissociation people and high dissociation people, because actually you get this difference response for individuals who are low dissociation in their cardiac response to self and other touch, whereas those individuals who have high dissociation, their cardiac response to self and other touch looks very, very similar. So their response in the heart isn't differentiating between whether they're touching themselves or someone else is touching them, which is so interesting. Maybe self-touch isn't being tagged as self in the same way for people who have a tendency for high dissociation. So in terms of the summary and conclusions, time delay between seen and felt sensations of touch can contribute to feelings of dissociation. These feelings relate to dissociative experiences experienced in everyday life, as indexed by a trait dissociation score. Participants are more sensitive to self-stroking than other stroking. When there's a time delay, they're more likely to notice that with self-stroking. And sensitivity to delay of self-generated sensations correlated with dissociative feelings in everyday life. So if you're more likely to notice things are out of sync, you're more likely to experience dissociation. And there's a failure of cardiac signatures to differentiate between self and other touch in individuals with high dissociation. So thank you to everyone in the lab, my collaborators, and a special thank you to Jamie, who ran this study and really was the intellectual force and was very helpful with the slides, and to Kathy, Bigna, Mart, Valerio, and Mike, who also helped considerably with this, and it was really based on their paradigm.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for this fascinating talk. Actually, you reversed part of my assumption about dissociation because I expected different correlations. So I was very interested in your talk. So open up the floor for questions. We have one. McClone Francis has asked, when you touch yourself without a tool, is via non-CT innervated Gleber skin touching CT innervated airy skin? CT's code self. Have you looked at this?
Oh, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I reread. Also, I am a little bit confused. So when you touch yourself without a tool, it is via non-CT innervated Gleber skin touching CT innervated airy skin. So TC code self. Have you looked at this?
Oh, well, no, because I think they did it both. We didn't manipulate whether it was, so it was, I think it was with a brush. I should double check. This is where I really need Jamie, but I believe people did, it's a great point. I believe that people did a brush in both self and other touch that should have balanced that out. I'm almost certain, but I wish Jamie was here to verify that. But it's an interesting point about also looking at that as well. And that would be a massive confound if that wasn't balanced.
Yeah, that's right. I have probably a naive question. I take advantage from the fact that people are thinking about their question. Do you know if there's correlation between this dissociative proneness and schizotypal trait, for example, in a healthy population? Because to me, it would make sense. But I don't know if somebody checked and how we can so reconcile all this data according to these two continuum in a way.
Yeah, no, that's why I think dissociation is such an important a thing to be focusing on, because absolutely it does seem like there's more and more data emerging that it's both highly elevated in individuals with schizotypy, schizophrenia, but they might also serve as a vulnerability factor. That seems to be emerging data that's suggesting that it is.
Cool. That makes sense. Luca Carnevali asks, have you looked at sex differences in HRV responses to touch?
Oh, again, a really important question. And I know that work by her and others suggests that it's a really important factor that needs to be taken into consideration. We have not looked at sex differences. The heart data was only acquired on just over half the participants, and we also had 2/3 women, so we're getting quite low N to be looking at that. But I think, especially as there are sex differences in also for schizophrenia and schizotypy, that they probably really are relevant. But that's not something that we've got power to look at in this data set.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if do you expect different profile in the responses in the frank pathological population? Because we know that sometimes what happened in the continuum is completely reversed when we have a look in the clinical samples. I was wondering if we can expect something maybe more extreme in a way, or we can also expect a completely different pattern of results.
I love that question because we're about to start testing this in schizophrenia patients. Also
amazing.
Collaboration with Bigner and Lab. So we've got the clinical ethics. We've signed up our first couple of schizophrenia patients, and we're really about to see. So that's absolutely the next step of how we see it as well. I'm definitely hypothesizing a continuum. And I think then it'll be very meaningful if we can show that to look at these sort of at-risk symptoms. But yeah, we don't yet know, but we'll have data on that soon.
And we look forward to your results.
Of course.
So thank you again, Sarah. This was a wonderful talk and a very inspiring and thorough discussion. Thank you again to join us. So now we have time for